Start here, part 5, the religious track. I recently heard one of my favorite creators on this app, Dan McClellan, refer to biblical archaeology as beginning in the 1800s with a bunch of men who had a spade in one hand and a Bible in the other, just going to the places mentioned in the Bible, digging up what they were sure was going to be evidence that every word of the Bible was true. In short, over time, as humans just got better archaeology, this did not turn out to be the case. We've certainly found evidence of place names, mostly from their neighbors, particularly Egypt. There is some corroboration perhaps of the existence of certain historical figures, and almost no extra-biblical evidence whatsoever that any of the events written down in the Hebrew Bible actually happened. Definitely not as written down, probably not at all. And yet you'll still hear bad faith claims based on the little data we have. Here's an example. The Merneptah Stele was written down by a pharaonic king in Egypt around 1208 BCE. Like every other pharaoh who was ever buried in a tomb, it contains a massive list of all his enemies he soundly defeated. And in that list, Israel is included as having been laid to waste and its seed ended. This is a reference to Israel roughly around the same time frame that Joshua and Judges is supposed to be taking place, which is so cool. It's a clue that there might have been some place called Israel that might be related to the mythologies told in the Hebrew Bible. But the problem shows up with people extrapolating from this all sorts of information that it does not contain. Is this the same Israel that was written about centuries later when a bunch of ethnic Jews wrote down their oral traditions in what eventually became the Hebrew Bible? Why does it mention the destruction of this place? You may say, well, all those old pharaohs were braggarts and liars, which is 100% true. Ancient peoples didn't really have a concept of the difference between fact and fiction. But we don't need to look at the event he described. Instead, we are just looking at the fact that he knew of a place in Canaan called Israel, which means that there must have been some interaction between Egypt and this place that is not mentioned in Joshua or Judges at all. Which means if somebody points to just the existence of the single word Israel in this inscription as proof the Hebrew Bible is true, without acknowledging that the rest of the inscription directly contradicts the very narrative they're trying to defend, they are guilty of the most egregious form of cherry picking. This is just one of many examples of this when people try and appeal to religion to defend Zionism. The biblical story describes the descendants of Abraham migrating from modern-day Iraq to Egypt and eventually invading the Promised Land and slaughtering and enslaving all of their enemies, the indigenous Canaanites. The real story is that the Israelites and Judeans were all Canaanites. They came out of Canaanite cultures, became various hill tribes and city-states, skirmished among each other and their nations. People migrated in, people migrated out, and that just went like the rest of history. There's no evidence of some huge violent upheaval at all. There's no evidence that a united monarchy ever existed between ancient Israel and Judea. There is an inscription on a stele at Tel Dan that's highly contested that might reference the house of David, but it's from hundreds of years later, so it might just be writing down the same legend and we're treating it as fact because it's just from the same rough period. And even if it did reference a house of David, again, it doesn't suddenly mean that the entire rest of the Hebrew Bible is true. There were eventually two separate polities. They might have had an alliance of some kind against the other hill tribes and city-states. There may have been some kind of exile under Cyrus the Great on the First Temple. There may have been some kind of destruction from the Romans under the Second Temple. But there's no evidence whatsoever that this was nearly as cataclysmic an event as the religious texts would have you believe. There's plenty of evidence of continued presence in Roman Palestine after the destruction of the Second Temple. The path towards a unified Bible and monotheism was gradual and lasted well into the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Key events like the Maccabean Revolt and the Hasmonean Dynasty were almost certainly much more politically motivated than anything else, certainly not solely as a response to religious persecution. The major movement of a Jewish community into Europe happened like 1,000 years later, likely as a result of trade migration. There's no religious basis whatsoever for return to Zion before Messianic times. The dreidel was a German gambling game, and diaspora as a method toward tikkun olam is one of the most beautiful concepts I've ever heard in my life. Finally, no matter how you look at it, no matter how you slice it, if every syllable of the Hebrew Bible was true, it still would not justify harming people in the modern era. Not one word of the Hebrew Bible or any other religious texts ever justifies the harming of another person, even though that is the main justification people use for harming another person. Next up, we'll talk about the non-mythologized, evidence-based history of Palestine.